Yo, what's up you guys? It's Case8 here, and welcome back to another video. We're going to be making a sort of deep down low sort of bass in this video. I kind of accidentally stumbled upon making this sound. I was just making a preset bank of nothing but bass house wobbles, and I just sort of played the right MIDI and made the right patch at the same time, and it kind of reminded me of deep down low, so take a listen. It sounds kind of like this. So it kind of reminds me of Deep Down Low. I wouldn't say it's a perfect remake. I don't really like remaking sounds anyways. But yeah, that's pretty close for just being massive and no processing. So it's actually very easy to make. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to put the preset up so you guys can pause and copy. And right after that, we're going to go ahead and just make this patch from scratch, and I'll explain some things that I did. So here's the patch. Alrighty then, so now that we're ready to go ahead and start working on this, let's go ahead and go to new sound, and we still have the same MIDI, so I'll show you the MIDI really quickly, just in case you're curious to how that goes. And again, I didn't do I didn't try to make the MIDI right either. I'm sure this is in the wrong key and all that stuff, but pretty much I'm playing something pretty low, like around G0, and then just kind of doing a little bit of this kind of stuff. So you get the idea, you kind of see how it goes. And let's start adding in some of the more important things. So we don't need to worry about filtering for this preset, but we need to go ahead and fix some things. So let's go our voicing. Let's make sure we're 16/1. We can be in any of these kind of voicing modes, but it really doesn't matter. We're going to be playing one note, so it doesn't matter if we keep in polyphonic or not. And we're going to go ahead and turn on pan position, because this when I was listening to Deep Down Low just a few minutes ago to see how close they were, the sound is really wide, so we're going to want to go ahead and just keep this on full invert on pan position, and that should be good. And we'll also go to our oscillator tab real quick. Let's just turn on the restart via gate, so every time we play a new note it will kind of act the same way. And let's go ahead and bring up that pitch bend range, because that's something I like to do. I like to have this go up and down a full octave. It just gives me the control I want with automation and all those kind of things. And let's go ahead and just leave everything like that. And we'll go to our main envelope. So envelope 4 is our main envelope inside of massive, and we're just going to pull that tech down real quick. So I think we're all good. We're kind of ready. And actually, let's go to the routing real quick. Let's just make sure that oscillator 3 is got the bypass mod in its way. So we're going to send oscillator 3 through the bypass, and this is kind of like a sub bass trick. So not that this patch needs it, I just like adding a little bit of sub so that every preset feels like it has some weight and could be a bass line as well. So if we go here and we turn this to a sine wave, just pull the wavetable position to sine, and we can just kind of play around with intensity, but we could just leave it at that, pull down the volume of the amp, so we don't want it to play with everything else. We just want this to go through the bypass mod. So now, pretty much, if you don't know what the bypass mod does, it means that it's this one oscillator that's just going to play outside of all the other sounds. So if you think about massive, like the oscillators, the effects, the inserts, the filters, everything plays and outputs through the master, but the bypass mod just goes straight past everything into the EQ and out the master. So it's a kind of interesting way to, like, let's say we had a ton of reverb on everything and we just sent one oscillator through everything else and around it. It's a really interesting way to create pads, to create bass lines, to add bass to a sound. So that's what we're doing here. This is just going to play outside the bypass mod. So not the main point of the video. That's definitely not what's going to give us the character of this sound, but let's go ahead and go to our LFO. Let's go ahead and place this on our amp. And we're just going to leave it at, we're going to sync it to 1/4. On the other preset, I had it a custom rate, but it pretty much was right around this rate. So this should work out just fine. We're going to pull this X fade curves, so that way we're only using this part of the LFO and we're not combining two shapes together. And let's go back and to our envelope 1. So we're going to pull the attack down and the level. So we get a shape that looks sort of like this. We'll have to play with it a bit to make sure we got the right sound, but for me what matters is that we're going to use this to sidechain our LFO. So we're going to pull the amp down, pull up the LFO, and we're going to engage the sidechain feature, which is one of my favorite features inside of Massive that I only recently started really finding ways to really use it. So I've always known how to use it, but I never found the right ways to use it. And when you're making a whole bank of like 64 presets of Wobble House, like this came in handy a lot of times. So almost every preset uses this in a whole bunch of places. So we're going to turn on the sidechain. We're going to use the down arrow. So pretty much what's going to happen is our envelope 1 is going to sort of manipulate our LFO on top of this. So it's a little bit different than if we had this off and we just had these both going at the same time. It's a way different sound. So when we turn this on, that goes away, and now LFO 1 or envelope 1 controls LFO 5. So it's kind of interesting, and that works perfectly because what we're going to want to do with our oscillator here is we're going to want to we're going to bring the amp down and just control it with the LFO, so that way everything has a wobble characteristic to it. And let's go ahead and change this to a basic wavetable, something like the additive mix 1, I think it was. I don't exactly remember, but I know we're going to pull these down. And let's go ahead and also put the LFO 5 on the wavetable position. So we're going to pull this all the way down and just do something like that. I don't exactly remember, so I'm going to be listening a bit. There's a little bit of nuances to the preset, but it's not a complex patch at all. So before we take a listen, let's just also turn on the modulation oscillator. So this is pretty much the cool way to get any sort of sound. So let's just throw a quick LFO on that, so the same one that we're using for everything else. And let's go ahead and just play it. Alright, so not exactly where we need it to be yet, but let's keep adding more of these envelope 1s in there because I really like using the sidechain feature now. Once you learn how to use it and once you kind of find the right ways to use it, you don't ever really stop using it. And let's go ahead and hear that. Okay, so I think that's pretty close to what it sounded like before I added a few other things. So let's go ahead and move on to the modulation oscillator. So let's go ahead and play around with that phase a little bit more. Let's go ahead and bring in another envelope 1 in here. I think I remember also doing something with envelope 2 on the pitch, so I think I brought this up an octave. So if I just hold down Alt, or I guess Option if you're on Mac, when you're clicked in any of these boxes inside of Massive that relates to pitch, you can kind of bring these up and down octaves really quickly. So holding down Alt if you're on Windows and Option on Mac. So I think that was really important to do as well because I didn't want to necessarily bring this up an octave or down an octave. I just kind of wanted to leave it at just 0 and then do something cool with the envelope 2. So I think envelope 2 just had a little bit of attack and that was it. And let's go ahead and sidechain this and let's mess around with it a bit. So that sounds a bit close. So we just have to add in everything else and then maybe come back to this and tweak it a little bit more. So with every patch you make, you have to come back and tweak certain things. You can't really nail it the first time. So let's go ahead and bring in some inserts so we can kind of just move on to the next thing because we don't have any filters to look at. And I think everything is sort of the shape that it needs to be, but let's actually start tweaking this because this really does change the sound. So let's go ahead and listen to that. Right, so that's exactly what I was saying. The envelope 1 really is a big, important key player in this. So again, I'm not trying to remake the patch that I showed you at the beginning perfectly either. We're trying to make something like it again from scratch. And that's kind of hard because I don't really remember it, especially only because I made that preset once. But let's go ahead and add in a little bit of insert here. So I like hard clipper, but I think parabolic shaper is what we'll go with. Just add a little bit dry, wet, and drive. And we're going to do something cool because I remember using this for sure. We're going to do a little trick with the delay insert, which is one of my favorite things to do now, which is I'm going to add the dry, wet pretty high on this, and we've got to make sure the routing is actually in the right place for this. And we'll put feedback where it needs to be as well. So I think that's where I had those. Really impossible to remember that. But what I'm going to do with the delay is we're going to create sort of a kind of interesting delay on the inserts, and depending on where you place it in the routing, like before certain filters, which doesn't matter in this case, or somewhere else, like it really does change the possibility of what you can get, and it sounds really cool in a lot of cases. So we'll play around with these two real quick. Let's hear what those sound like. So the delay doesn't really, it's not too obvious here. Usually I notice when you have the filters and the feedback placed certainly somewhere around that insert, it does become a little bit more interesting. So if I placed, if I found a way to put the feedback before the insert 2 somewhere back here, that might sound better. So let's hear that. So it's an interesting way to get a weird sort of effect that can either sound like it's making it a bit wider because we're delaying a bit of the sides, or because it just sounds really weird after the certain filters and the feedback that you're using. So I use a lot of feedback on a lot of these patches. Like in a lot of cases I crank them all the way up, and it sounds really interesting depending on what I've done with the filtering. So I think we're gonna add a little bit of vibrato to this, and I think we can just add a bit of chorus, or if we want to add more of distortion type stuff, we can add the tubes, but a little bit chorus. And again, this really isn't necessary either. It's kind of, those are the settings I use, because if we have too much, it sounds a bit off, and we want the sound to kind of sound very simple. And let's go ahead and add a little bit of dimension expander, which is really cool. Again, having that somewhere after the insert 2, because the insert 2 is a delay now, and now with dimension expander, which in its own way is a delay sorta, we can kind of get a really wide sounding preset, which is very important. So again, we'll make sure that this is on, and let's go to our EQ. So in case you missed that, these are the settings I'm using, and let's go ahead and bring up our high shelf. I did some other cool stuff before with like this. I like to add a lot of LFOs and envelopes to things and get a lot of movement in the preset, but I'm just keeping this as simple as it needs to be. So let's go ahead and just keep it something like that. Let's take a listen. Alright, so as you heard, I think we're about done. If you want to go ahead and do extra processing and tweak the patch a little bit more, you can probably get really close to the actual sound, but like I said, I wasn't exactly trying to go for a remake. So thanks guys for watching, and of course, late.